A long time ago, a duke ruled over a large area from his stately castle. The larders were well stocked, his subjects were energetic and happy, and his succession was secure. Numerous herds of cattle grazed on the green mountain slopes, surrounded by impenetrable forests and swamps where hardly anyone had ever set foot. Times were good, but one day a dark evil befell his lands, playing havoc with him and his subjects. The marshes, which later became Lake Vorthersee, were home to a terrible lindworm that had wings but could not fly. The lindworm regularly caused fear and terror among the people and regularly tore up cattle on the pasture. It had scaly skin, razor-sharp teeth, sharp claws, and could breathe smoke and fire. Its roar could be heard from afar and always heralded doom. The fear of the lindworm among the people meant that they hardly dared to leave their homes. As a result, they were no longer able to fulfill their duties and were doomed to destruction. Nevertheless, a few brave people set off in search of the monster. They roamed the dense swamps full of moss, dead trees, and putrid water that seemed to stretch endlessly. But their search for the lindworm was always in vain, and so one day they had to admit their powerlessness. The lindworm was nowhere to be found. The Duke refused to accept his fate and had a solid tower built on the edge of the swamp, promising whoever managed to take possession of the monster this very tower, as well as everything he could see from the top of the tower. In addition, freedom beckoned if the conqueror of the lindworm was a slave. Lured by the rich reward, many people came together and made plans on how to defeat the lindworm. For days they pondered next to crackling campfires and discussed every idea that came up. The plan of an astute farmer was ultimately deemed the best. A ruse was to overcome the evil. The farmer's plan was to build a large, robust iron cage big enough for the lindworm. The cage was also to be firmly anchored to the ground with a chain to make everything as stable as possible. The people set to work. They worked day and night to realize this plan. The hammering of the blacksmith's hammer could be heard incessantly, and the nights were brightly lit by the forge fires and glowing pieces of iron. The work was arduous, but the result was impressive. An enormous cage with a huge gate now stood in a meadow, ready to catch something. The biggest and fattest ox they could find was driven into the cage the very next day. It was supposed to attract the lindworm and make it enter the cage. The people hid behind piles of earth and waited. The farmer's plan seemed to work. It wasn't long before they heard something coming from the swamp. The lindworm had scented the ox and was now crawling out of its hiding place in search of it. The lindworm, suspecting nothing bad, slowly entered the cage to devour the ox with its mouth full of teeth. Distracted by his prey, some people came out of hiding, slammed the massive iron gate of the cage shut, and locked it. Now trapped, the lindworm could no longer put up much of a fight, so many people plucked up courage, armed themselves with whatever they could find, and began to attack the monster. After a long and fierce battle, the monster was defeated, and the people fell into each other's arms with joy. The land was now free of the plague of the lindworm, and the people were relieved. The Duke rejoiced and organized a feast to celebrate the defeat of the evil. When the rejoicing subsided, the Duke kept his promise. The farmer who had devised the successful plan accepted the promised reward, and from then on ruled over everything he could see from his tower. an area stretching from the marshes that later became known as Lake Wörthersee to the River Drau. A tranquil village was built on the site of the battle with the Lindworm, and a protective castle was built where the tower had stood. A stone statue was erected in the center to commemorate the battle with the Lindworm, which still stands there today and has become the town's landmark. Over the course of time, this small village developed into today's city of Klagenfurt in Austria. The town's coat of arms still shows the tower, which was built on the edge of the swamp, as well as the defeated Lindwurm.